It is the Fenway Rundown on a Wednesday, November 19th. I am home from Vegas. I did have to hitchhike home after some bad run at Blackjack at Treasure Island. You think that those, small minimums would, prevent you from that. No, it was fine. It was a fun trip. The Cosmopolitan out there where the MLB awards and meetings had very, very, very nice. And good weather this time of year. So, some ups and downs with blackjack. That's how it goes. Red Sox didn't
I
make
broke
moves.
even, says
Yeah,
every person leaving Vegas.
that's true. I'm not going to say I did. I was a little below that, but that's why we soldier on the Fenway Rundown podcast. The Red Sox did not make moves last week before they left those meetings. They waited
And they
till
made up
yesterday.
for it in one day.
Yeah, they made up for it on Tuesday, where what is usually a quiet, kind of nerdy baseball deadline about adding guys to the 40-man roster and Rule 5 protections and those types of things. Um, it turned into a super, super busy day for Craig Breslow in terms of volume. It was kind of quantity over quality when it comes to the moves that were made. We will get to all of them. But, I think you can look at kind of what happened and look at some overall themes. I wrote about that on the site last night. So we'll get right into it. So, in case you missed it, Craig Breslow swings four trades, count them four, on Tuesday, cuts two other guys who were DFA'd, adds three prospects to the 40-man roster. The trades, Brennan Bernardino to the Rockies, I think is the most significant. Chris Murphy to the White Sox. Luis Guerrero to the Rays for Tristan Gray, who's an infielder who goes on the big league roster, and then a minor league trade, perhaps the best prospect they got, Alex Hoppe, a pitcher who was Rule 5 eligible, has never pitched in the majors, goes to Seattle for a catching prospect, and Luke Heyman. Nate Lowe, DFA'd, Josh Winkowski, DFA'd, and the three guys that are added, David Sandlin, as we thought, and then Shane Drowan and Tyler Uberstein, who let's face it, neither of us probably knew much about before the second half of this year. And Wister, a guy who's never, I don't think, had a big league invite in camp when we usually get to know a lot of these players. Had a really good season with the Wister Red Sox, put himself in position to be, protected at this deadline. And Breslow had to make some tough decisions yesterday. So if I'm giving you my overall, TLDR thought on it, shows that there's a lot of pitching depth to the point where they were able to trade, four pitchers, two with a lot of major league experience, or one with a lot, obviously, with Bernardino, and Murphy pitched well last year too. Four position players, I think that's notable, and also the fact they were comfortable replacing, those guys with, three guys with no major league time on the 40 man, and that there were four pitchers at least. And this doesn't even count the guys who might get claimed, from Monegro to Mullins to some of these other guys. Teams want the pitchers at the upper levels of their minors. That has not been the case in previous years. And it's not just the Tollies and the earlies that have talent now. You can see that a lot of guys do based on what happened yesterday. And then I would just say, surprised they traded Bernardino, but we'll get to that too.
Yeah, well, look, I look at it this way. Ordinarily, this day is full of Red Sox, designate X player for assignment. It's kind of a nominal prospect at AA or AAA, and most fans say, "Who's that?" Well, it's different this year. The fact that they moved Murphy and they moved Bernardino, two guys that from the last couple of years. Murphy with Tommy John missing a year, but contributed in two of the last 3 years. Bernardino was a guy that, was almost like an Iron Man guy out of their bullpen, where they got a lot of use out of. It was one of Heim Bloom's best low-key acquisitions that proved to be a pretty fruitful contributor to the bullpen over the last few years. But the fact that the Red Sox are now moving recognizable major league accomplished players to create room for some guys to protect from the Rule 5 speaks to the overall talent level in the organization now. It's not these anonymous, you're not swapping out some anonymous minor leaguer for another guy who you haven't really heard of.
Yeah, and I wrote this yesterday, but last year they DFA'd, Brian Mata and Isaiah Campbell, which are super easy calls, right? Like those guys at that point. compared to now, it's a big difference.
Yeah, now you're jettisoning guys that have accomplished something
Hmm.
and making room for them, getting prospects in return who don't have to go on the 40 man right now, and clearing room for guys like Drowan and Uberstein and a couple of others that they added yesterday. Sandlin being the other. It is a measure and a snapshot of how improved the organization is. And people, I'm sure there are people like, oh, I don't care. What are they doing with Bregman? What are they doing with Alonso? They want big names. That'll come.
Yeah.
But the fact that at the bottom of the roster, the last 6 or 7 spots on the 40 man have been upgraded to the degree that they have is a measure of how much progress the organization has made the last couple of years, particularly in the pitching department, as you noted. Not a lot of teams are unloading guys who pitched significant roles for a playoff team to make room for, future prospects and players. But that's what the Red Sox did on Tuesday.
Yep. And like I said, you look at they had three guys that they needed to protect. Hoppy is a guy that Seattle protected after the trade, a guy who's not been really on the radar here, but has the stuff. So that's four. And you have, I looked at a couple of Baseball America's write-ups today, and they're talking about Yordani Monegro, who had Tommy John last year, and Hayden Mullins as two guys in the Red Sox system who are Rule 5 candidates. They might get plucked. They were unprotected, so that's six. You think about, last year, Bastardo got picked by Toronto. Um, that happened 1 minute after the Crochet trade, so it wasn't a real focus for us at that time.
Tend to be a little obscured.
It was. People, I get all the shit for every time I fly, something happens. You were boarding a plane when Crochet get traded, so the shoe is on the other foot for once.
For once.
Yes.
For once.
Yep. December 2nd, next flight. Sox are
For
making
once.
a move. And now I lost my train of thought.
Oh,
And then
that's
you,
too bad.
you think of the guys who have been, Noah Song got plucked a couple years ago. Drowan himself was a Rule 5 guy
Yeah,
a
and
couple
both
years
those guys
ago.
came back.
Yep. And so, it speaks to kind of the pitching depth from where it was. And I do think it's interesting. Like, we've had this conversation about, it was a big goal of Breslow's when he came in. Way too many position players, not enough pitchers in the system. Obviously, the Quinn Priester trade that backfired in April, no one thought it was going to at the time, was an example of that, going the other way. But look at, what they did yesterday. All four of the trades they made, they get Gray on the major league roster, who's an infielder utility type. They get Ward from the Rockies for Bernardino, who will probably be in big league camp as a guy who hit, AAA infielder, outfielder. And then two catchers, a young one from the White Sox and this Heyman draftee from Seattle. So that's, they make four trades yesterday. They also lop off Winkowski. They added balance the other way, which I think is worth talking about too.
Well, and they also, of the players they acquired in deals, two of them were catchers.
Yep.
And we know that is a thin area in the organization, thanks to the trade of Kyle Teal, the loss of a couple of other guys beyond Connor Wong as the backup at the major league level, and he's arbitration eligible, and we expect will be tendered a contract by tomorrow and the deadline. There's kind of a fall off. They've had kind of those major league journeyman guys in reserve at Worcester, like Heineman and others in the past, but they haven't
Monty
had
Grandal.
Right. But they haven't had that catching prospect moving up through the system. Now, Josephson Garcia's younger brother is another that
The username.
right, might be on the fast track eventually, but catching's a hugely important position. And the fact that they were able to sort of I don't want to say stumble upon. They obviously zeroed in on Carlos Narvaez in that trade a year ago also happened on the same day as the Crochet deal,
Hmm.
and great for them. Good job of identifying sort of an undervalued catcher elsewhere who steps in and gets the opportunity when Wong gets hurt and establishes himself as their number one catcher. But it's good to have other options and other guys in that pipeline that may be real prospects in a year or two.
Yep. And obviously, they went out and got Heyman yesterday, not John, and Ronnie Hernandez, who is younger in the system from the White Sox. The guys they did trade, I think worth talking about. Bernardino was a guy who, as you mentioned, pitched a lot the last 3 years, some big spots, took the ball every day. Murphy was a guy who I think gave them a lot more than we thought, because kind of a forgotten guy after Tommy John. Guerrero, a guy that we talked about, he's a McAdam guy. I always inflate that because you thought he had good stuff and had the potential to close. We talked about this the other day. And Josh Winkowski, a guy who, just 2 years ago, had like 85 innings out of the bullpen and a really low ERA and pitched a lot of big spots for that team. Um, Number one, do you think that any of these guys are risky to let get away? And number two, what does it say about the bullpen structure? I'll answer my own question on the second one. You look at who's left for left-handed relievers. Aroldis Chapman doesn't count because he's just a closer. He's the ninth inning guy. He's not going to be a matchup guy, obviously. So you have Giovanni Moran and maybe some starters turn relievers. You're looking at, Wilson, Matz, Bernardino, and Murphy now out of the organization as we sit here. They're going to add to that group, whether they bring Wilson back or Matz back or both. I think they now need like two veteran lefties. Not going to be huge deals, maybe a Gregory Soto or Rogers or some of these guys. But do you think any of them are going to possibly be regret guys moving forward?
I could see Murphy coming back to bite him a little bit down the road.
Hmm. Especially
Obviously,
if he starts.
yeah, he could grow into that role. He seemed to have the propensity to have a really bad outing every 10 or 12 that would
Yeah.
inflate his numbers. That happened a couple of times in the
Yep.
second half of the season.
That
But there
ninth
were
inning in
times,
Tampa stands out.
right. There were times when he really was pretty effective for them. And, as a relatively young guy, there could be an opportunity to grow into another role and be a bigger contributor. I say less so on Bernardino because, and maybe it's unfair, but part of it is how they found him. As a,
Okay, did anyone else know that he's about to be 34?
I mean, I knew he was in his early 30s. I would
I
have said
mean,
maybe 32 or
I
33, but
that is not what I thought his age was. So I kind of get it, but
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. And look, we know that performance on the part of a lot of relievers is pretty fungible from one year to the next. Guys bounce around. Almost by definition, those veteran relievers end up pitching for 5 or 6 different organizations over the course of their career. Maybe Bernardino continues to pitch as effectively as he did the last couple of years. Maybe he kind of has a bad year and then bounces back in 27. That's the nature of the job. That's why a lot of teams don't want to commit multiple years to guys, even after there has, been a demonstration that they have 2 or 3 solid years in a row, the way Bernardino has. I don't think they ever saw him as a super high leverage guy. He was more an all purpose. He did everything from open a few times to matchup to length and multi inning work. And look, he did his job well. As I said, it was one of the best small moves of the Heim Bloom era. But frankly, those guys are kind of a dime a dozen, and you stumble upon one almost every year.
Yeah, I'm going to go off the beaten track here and say that I think that Winkowski is a guy who, with the change of scenery, could be pretty good. Pulling up the
A lot
stats.
depends on his health, obviously.
Yeah, he had an elbow strain last year. He didn't pitch after May 11th. People were saying late in the year that he was a guy that was supposed to be, um, getting healthier and should be good to go. He obviously avoided surgery. that's definitely something teams are going to have to monitor. He will be almost certainly a free agent this week if the Red Sox don't find a trade partner, which they weren't able to. I look back to 2023, the expected numbers were worse, but when you look at what he gave them, a 2.88 ERA in 60 appearances, 84 and a third innings. He struck out 82 in that span. He was a guy for whatever reason that didn't take to the Andrew Bailey model. And the switch from Bush to Bailey and the switch to Breslow and Willard, just a guy that things did not line up with the stuff in the attack plan. Cora said that a couple times and fell out of favor, but I think he's a guy that another guy, talk about Murphy, Winkowski has starting experience, including, I think he was doing it this year in Worcester before he got hurt.
Yep. And, a couple of springs ago, he was a guy that was still auditioning for a spot in the
Right.
rotation. Again, another snapshot
Mm-hmm.
of how much better the pitching pipeline and the accumulated talent in the organization is. Try considering, and this is no knock on Josh Winkowski. I mean, if you lined up the starting candidates and included him here, he wouldn't crack the top dozen in this organization.
Yep.
And it was only 2 springs ago where he was well into camp competing for a spot for the opening day rotation.
Right. And, look at, Drowan clearly passed him. And we didn't even talk about him when we talk about the, 8, 10 guys that they have in the back end from the Criswells and the Harrisons and Early and Tolley and Fitz and Sandoval and Crawford. And, that's all behind Crochet and Bayo and all that type of stuff. So, yeah, it does speak to it. I think, this offseason's all about upgrading the high end of the roster. That's what we're going to talk about until probably February, and the Alonsos and Bregmans and Valdez and Dylan Cease and Joe Ryans of the world are the headline grabbers. But, these moves also do matter, especially when they come, yesterday in bunches like they do. I do think that they're going to have to spend on that left-handed reliever, somebody pretty good. Whether you can get that guy for the Justin Wilson deal of two and change last year, or you have to pay him, 1 for 7 or, 2 for 10 or something like that. It'll be interesting to see what they do, but they do need some guys who can get lefties out now. And, they're not going to make these moves and pigeonhole, we're going to have Tolley pitch the 7th, or we're going to have Harrison do that. They're going to stretch them all out and see how it shakes out. But they created a need, and, that I don't blame them for, maybe wanting upgrades. To me, Wilson and Matz are the types of guys that I think they're going to target anyway. So maybe 1 or 2 comes back. But that area of the roster has been
Wilson
ravaged.
will be worth on the free agent market for a guy who signed for 225 last year. You got to think that number's at least doubled. To bring him back, and it may require guaranteeing or at least providing an option for a second year because of the market he created for himself with a really strong season.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously kind of ran out of gas at the end, and lefties were hitting him super hard, and it was super stellar, for a long time, and I think it kind of collapsed at the end. But a guy that we saw come in and felt like it was an automatic inning every time. Matt's, other than a couple blowouts, was pretty good. He's pretty good with St. Louis too. A guy who is now a traditional reliever but has starting experience. So those will be interesting. I wrote about this, like I said yesterday, and I mentioned all these names here. Giovanni Moran somehow still on the roster, but you look at, Wilson, Matz, Hobie Milner, Sean Newcomb, who had an unbelievable year with the A's, which is funny to be talking about him now.
Drew Pomerantz. That's
Theo
your
Bar,
man right there.
Danny Colom, Soto, Caleb Ferguson, Taylor Rogers. Point is, Bernardino, Matz, Murphy, and Wilson gave the Red Sox like more than 150 innings last year. That's no small thing.
They're going to have to be replaced somehow
over the course of the season. Nate Lowe was DFA'd, the least surprising thing of the offseason.
The timing was a little surprising. I think we all expected him to be non-tendered, but
no, it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, but it happened 2 days sooner and via a different method than I think a lot of people anticipated.
Well, that's from what I've heard, sets up just they can non-tender him still on Friday, and same with Winkowski. So those guys are expected to be free agents. I think with Lowe, it's just the basic. I had a couple, but this is as bad as it gets, I think, in terms of audience reaction. I had a couple people calling them cheap for not bringing him back at $13.5 million. I think Nate
Bringing
Lowe is
him
one of
back at that money would have been foolish.
the bringing him back at that money would be fireable for Craig Breslow, I think. So, look, I think Nate Lowe still has something in the tank. He's an unbelievably nice guy. By the way, I was texting a couple of friends on the beat, Bradford and Ian Brown yesterday, and saying like they actually yesterday, if there's a big takeaway other than the ones that fans care about, they got rid of a lot of media friendly nice guys, all in one fell
Yep.
swoop. Winkowski was a quote factory. Guerrero has a really good story, obviously, from being from here and everything. Um, and then, Lowe, unbelievably nice. Murphy, super nice and accessible. Bernardino, like the nicest guy, always had a smile on his face. So, not a good day for the beat yesterday, I will add. But with Lowe,
It's
like,
weird that they didn't
they didn't
consult
consult
us
us.
on
I
that.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah, horrible.
But,
They never
they
asked.
must have missed us.
I know. But yeah, with Lowe, I mean, it just boils down to this. Once you're in the arbitration system, there's rules that govern that. He made 10 something last year. If he negotiated an arbitration deal, which is now the Red Sox problem because they signed him, he would have to make more than that by the rule. And the projection was 13 and a half based on where his floor was last year. This is a guy who hit 220 with a 6 something OPS and declining defense and can't run. Did he give the Red Sox a little bit down the stretch? And was he an upgrade over what they had? Yeah. Is he a guy who could probably make 1 for 7, 1 for 6, 1 for 5 on the free agent market? Yeah. He's not going to get 1 for 13 on the open market.
Yeah,
So if the
and I
Red
don't think
Sox,
he's going to get any kind of that money here.
right,
Because as we talked a little bit last night, how much you want to rely on Tristan Casas is one thing, both because of the injury that he's coming off with a major knee injury and surgery, and his inconsistency at the major league level.
yeah,
But all things being equal, you would much rather have Tristan Casas at 1.5 million or whatever his ARB
right.
projection is, than Nate Lowe at 7 million or 6.5 million. I don't think you expect either one of them to be the everyday first baseman. But if you're looking at one as a platoon partner or a backup, then why not go with a guy that you can pay 1.5 million and probably get close to that same production that Lowe gave you over the final 6 weeks?
One of the other things I talked about or wrote about yesterday was like this utility competition, adding Gray and then Ward, who, has never been in the majors but is 27. Not good news for all these guys that you have on the roster who have been important pieces in the last couple of years, but you don't see going forward. That group, Sogard, Eaton, David Hamilton, Von Grissom, uh, you know, they have all those guys and they still wanted Gray. They have all those guys and they still wanted Ward. I think to me, that's an area of the roster you're going to see some turnover too,
Yep.
whether they can offload Grissom or DFA Eaton. I mean, it's kind of crazy. You're going to be thinking about like, okay, these guys started playoff games for you 6 weeks ago and now they're in DFA territory, but shows you how banged up the roster was late.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't, no disrespect to Nate Eaton, but it wasn't a good sign or a positive snapshot of where the Red Sox were in early October that he's playing right field in a couple of playoff games. I mean, he's a journeyman guy who might be useful off the bench, can play third base, can play the outfield, has good speed, but is not seen as an anywhere near to be an everyday big leaguer. And the fact that he was in the starting lineup in 2/3 of their playoff games was an indictment of where they were health wise.
Yep. So that's kind of what the roster stuff meant yesterday. Friday night at 6 is the non-tender deadline. The Red Sox, as I have mentioned before, have a lot of arbitration eligible guys, like 9 of them, but most of them have been taken care of. Duran got a new deal. Bernardino's gone. Lowe and Winkowski are gone. That leaves you with Houck, Cutter Crawford, Romy Gonzalez, Connor Wong, and Tristan Casas. We reported Monday that Houck is likely to be tendered a contract. That was up for some debate because he's having Tommy John and you can take a salary off the books, but you do make him a free agent. Frankly, it's a small market move the Red Sox don't seem intent on making. That is the expectation heading into Friday. They'll tender him and figure out his deal. The other guys on that list, Crawford, Romy Gonzalez, Connor Wong, and Casas. I think we expect all of them to be back. None of those guys projected to make more than like 2 2.7, all between like 1 and 2.
Yep.
Even Wong at that price we've talked about is all right. I think it's a pretty uneventful non-tender deadline. There's not some easy releases. Obviously they got a lot of that work done yesterday. Where I think it comes to be interesting for the Red Sox is, are there guys that, get non-tendered by other teams that you can pick up? We've seen them do this in previous years. Patrick Sandoval was a guy who was non-tendered by the Angels last year because he had Tommy John. The Red Sox signed him a couple weeks later. Hunter Renfroe, the year that he came here, was a non-tender guy by the Rays, who the Red Sox signed very quickly after Plawecki was. So this is an opportunity where you can get some unexpected free agents. We don't have that list in front of us because it's going to happen in the future. So we're not going to discuss that too long today. I do want to end with this on the free agent market. We have, since we last spoke, which was a week ago, because Sean, you so rudely skipped our David Ortiz interview for your son's wedding.
I know. Where are my priorities?
I know, seriously. All work, no play. If I have to grind, you have to grind. Should have zoomed in from the reception. That would have been a real commitment to the gig. Congratulations to our best listener, Connor McAdam, by the way, who I know is
loyal listener.
He is always locked in. So since that wedding, 5 guys have come off the board, and the market has, in its own way, moved a little bit. The big deal, of course, Josh Naylor goes back to Seattle, 5 for 92.5. And then yesterday, 4 guys accepted the qualifying offer, which is a record. And you see 4 guys off the free agent market. They are Gleyber Torres to Detroit, Trent Grisham to the Yankees, and perhaps the biggest surprise, Shota Imanaga goes back to the Cubs, and Brandon Woodruff to the Brewers. Last week at the GM meetings, talking to some other reporters and national people when those decisions were almost due. I mean, Gleyber and Woodruff kind of would have been silly not to. Obviously they can sense their markets at this point. I feel like Grisham was a bit of a surprise considering teams might like the skill set. All that is to say, I don't think that any of these 5 moves are going to ruin the Red Sox offseason, but you could see Imanaga or Woodruff being somebody they could be interested in, and potentially Naylor. So it just thins out the market a little bit. There's fewer options for teams looking for starters. 2 of those guys off the board. Fewer options for guys looking for a power hitting first baseman. That guy's going back to Seattle. I think the biggest impact, though, to give a very long-winded question and then answer it myself, is, does Seattle have the money to go after somebody like Bregman after giving $100 million to Naylor? That's a big question, and we'll see.
They've never really spent commensurate to their market and their ticket sales. I mean, that's a team that draws very well year. Yeah, right. It's a deep-pocketed ownership, but they don't always act that way. You would think that, having a deep playoff run. Remember, this is the only franchise of the 30 that has never been to a World Series. That is to say, has never won a pennant. And, they're in that window now with their pitching, with the development of, cornerstone players like, Cal Raleigh and Julio Rodriguez, the starting rotation they have, adding Naylor. The time is now. And adding somebody like Bregman, another veteran voice in that clubhouse would be huge. But it remains to be seen. I know this was not a 9-figure spend on the part of the Mariners, but it was close, $92.5 million. Are they willing to spend, what is likely to be twice that to get Alex Bregman? I'm going to guess no. But they probably should, or they should at least consider it.
Yeah, I mean, I think they need to, go all. If there's ever a time for them to go all in, it's now. They can. Dipoto is going to make 30 trades this winter as he always does, but actually, spending 2 could be super beneficial. I like Naylor. I think he's a good player. I think that's a fair deal. And I think he's a guy that, for whatever reason, the Red Sox weren't. I think his skill set's like kind of, what the best version of Casas could be, and so the Red Sox might think they have an unproven Josh Naylor at home.
Show me Tristan Casas swiping 30 bases the way Josh Naylor did.
Yeah, but that is one of the great eye tests. You can't believe it type of things.
I know, but he did it. It speaks to his baseball acumen in terms of picking the right time to. He's one of, I think he's bottom 5 percentile in foot speed, but
Yeah.
he somehow picks his turn, picks his opportunity, and got 25 to 30 stolen bases, which is as I said, a testament to his baseball intelligence.
Yeah. Well, the intelligence will be on display in Seattle for the next 5 years. That is the Fenway rundown for today. There was a lot of news. We've been complaining for so long about how there's nothing. And so we will be back with more later in the week.